Those are going to join us tonight. Hopefully, this will add a little bit of depth to some of the lectures you might have been attending recently at the school on money, because these next two lectures are on money, currency, and credit. And this particular lecture is really a history lesson, and that is, how it all began. So that's really what I pick up, and I hope that you will join in and ask me questions as I go through this particular lecture. So starting off, I would say that the arguments over what constitutes a just money system, a just system of credit and banking, have been going on for, well, several thousand years. And so what I'm going to do now is examine some of the history of how money came into use and how its use and then abuse contributed to the growth and collapse of societies throughout the ancient and modern eras. So money is extremely important. We're still debating on what constitutes the best system of money, and many thoughtful people who studied the history of money, studied the issues, have come up with different answers. And Henry George had his own particular answers in his writings, and he offers us a definition of money as follows. He says, money is a general medium of exchange, the common flow through which wealth is transformed from one form to another. So money, in his view, is not wealth. And you have to keep that in mind as we go through this discussion. It may take the form of something that's tangible. There's just some examples throughout history of some of the tangible things that have been used as money. Everything from cattle, beads, salt, barley, whiskey, and tobacco served as mediums of exchange. Commodity money circulated based on wide acceptance, on scarcity, and or on a high amount of labor required to produce the commodity. So it takes us, these commodities used as mediums of exchange take us one step away from barter, because these generally accepted goods everyone would accept, and there was relative pricing established by market forces between, how much in the way of tobacco would purchase a cow, how much in the way of these beads or whatever was developed, how much labor went into them, determined how much someone was willing to exchange for them if they thought the beads had the equal value or use to them in their own society. The touchstone was something that eventually was found to be really useful and led to a change in what constituted money. The touchstone made it possible to test soft metals for their purity. And this allows one to quickly determine the content of a particular metal in a coin, or even of raw metals. So from the time that the touchstone was discovered, gold and silver, although relatively scarce, spread around the entire world as standard forms of money. An important characteristic, of course, was that they were essentially indestructible. Unlike the tangible goods that I just showed you that deteriorate over time, are consumable, etc., gold and silver and precious metals basically exist forever. They can be lost, of course, as is often the case throughout history, but they're pretty much difficult to destroy. So we have early coins, and early coins were subject to one big problem. That is, they could be counterfeited, or what in economics terms is called debasement. So you can debase the coinage. So how do you get around this problem of counterfeiting of coinage? Well, stamp the coins with images like we have here. That makes it more difficult. Now, it didn't solve one other problem, however. The coins could still be shaved to produce a small amount of raw metal. Those shavings could be gathered together, melted down, and you'd have enough new metal to mint a new counterfeit coin. So that's one way for people to create money out of almost nothing. So additional innovations were needed. Anyone have an idea of what the next innovation might have been? Remember, we're talking about coins.
Ridges.
Excellent. That's
Round the
exactly right. So to counter that, issuers of money added one new important element: coins with ridged edges could no longer be shaved, thus preventing the debasement of the coinage. And I would just add that private individuals exchanging coinage for goods and services would have been glad that this innovation came about, because it prevented the kings and the princes from shaving coins taken in as rents and taxes. And so it prevented those in control from actually creating more money out of the money that they were receiving from taxes and whatever fees were being collected. So you have that as a basis, but what about the powerful states such as the Roman Empire? Well, if you have a government sufficiently powerful that you can enforce whatever laws you put on the books, you can mandate the use of less valuable metals, or in the case of the Roman Empire, they even mandated the use and acceptance of wooden coins. So when Rome said you must accept these wooden coins as legal tender, and these coins are needed to pay either ground rents for leased land, for dwellings, for taxes, or for tribute, then those coins are going to be accepted and have wide use. So when precious metals were scarce in some parts of the Roman Empire, they could simply mandate the use of copper or any other metal, or in some cases, and I don't remember the extent of them, but they used wooden coins. Well, what happens after Rome falls, which is, the largest economic and political empire of the ancient world? Well, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there's a gradual expansion of feudal manors throughout the European continent, and this led to a decline in money circulation. The lords of the feudal manors took a share of crops from peasants in lieu of money rents and taxes, because the peasants just didn't have the money. And then peasants engaged in barter, but of course they had little surplus to trade. This image of a feudal enclave suggests a couple things. One is the central authority at the center of the feudal community had a trustee type responsibility. In other words, they were collecting in rents and taxes goods produced by the peasants in the outskirts. And one of their responsibilities was to keep enough on hand so that if there was a flood or a drought or a fire or whatever, that they would provide some subsistence for the people until they could recover. And that's a pretty significant responsibility, obligation towards the people, even though the feudal lords are basically running things. So it has to work with a reciprocal level of responsibility. When that reciprocity breaks down, then trouble really enters. And when did the reciprocity start to break down? It started to break down with the Crusades. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade began. And here the Christian armies sacked Constantinople. They returned home with huge quantities of precious stones, gold and silver, worth 1 million silver marks. And converting that today, it was about $196 million worth of precious metals and stones. So when the European princes and knights returned home, bringing with this new precious metal wealth and stones, this set the stage for the replacement of the feudal arrangements with a cash and credit-driven market system. So you can just think about that. Now you have this new form of money being brought in that's extensive compared to what was available previously. So what are the peasants now required to do? They're required to take their crops to the markets, sell their crops for cash, and then from that cash pay the ground rents and taxes to the land baron. So feudal obligations break down. The peasants now assume the risk of a failed crop or insufficient prices for what they're sold. If their crops fail and they can't pay their ground rents to the feudal lords, they get evicted. They get kicked off of their land, and some other peasant or some other group of people, take over control. They bid for control, and now you have the beginnings of a commodities market in land. And that changes everything. When now land is not simply allocated to peasants in order to support the entire community, support the feudal lord, but is now going to be bought and sold and financed. You're going to need a lot more money and a much more sophisticated system of banking and credit. The end of the Crusades left a lot of European princes holding new estates in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. So trade routes were renewed, and the flow of money created the need for a new class of people, merchant bankers. So this is an early map of the main cities in Europe at the time. And it turns out that because of their locations, Venice and Genoa became major centers of Mediterranean commerce. Florence, however, emerged as a center of banking. And you can see how easy it is for shipping to get from one end of the Mediterranean all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean and find their way up, towards Britain and the northern part of what was then Normandy, I guess. Now, there were a number of families that were pretty dominant in this rise of the merchant banking class. In Florence, it was the Bardi and Peruzzi families. And they were established in the 14th century. They had branches in other parts of Europe to facilitate their trading activities. And both of these banking families made some serious mistakes. They loaned to some of the princes who were engaged in war with one another over territory. And so both of these families had made a lot of loans to Edward III of England to finance the 100 Years' War against France. Their problem was that Edward defaulted and both of the banking families failed. About 1429, a man named Jacques Coeur formed a commercial partnership with two brothers named Goddard. And in 1432, he was actually doing business in Damascus, purchasing goods for shipment back to France. 4 years later, he's appointed master of the Paris Mint and to other high offices. And by 1450, he was, historians tell us, the wealthiest of all Frenchmen. However, as these stories are so filled with intrigue, he was accused of poisoning an aristocratic woman, arrested, and his property confiscated by the king. He managed to make his escape, but he pretty much disappeared from history after that. In southern Germany, the family known as Fugger, Fugger, financed the House of Habsburg. They made their first loan to a Habsburg Archduke in 1487, and as security, they took an interest in silver and copper mines. In 1491 and again in 1505, they made loans to Maximilian. They secured the feudal rights to 2 Austrian counties. And then in 1519, the bankers financed the campaign of Maximilian's grandson, Charles, to be elected emperor. So you can see how the banking community is very, very interlocked with the hierarchy in charge of, government. And that relationship is cemented all the way through to the modern times. By the end of the 16th century, however, they seemed to get smart and they withdrew from financial risk taking, and they settled into basically an aristocratic existence where they were no longer involved in financing any of the prince's wars. And this is their family castle in Western Slovakia. I don't know what eventually happened to them, but that's for another historian to take a look at. But after all this, the stage is really finally set for the first modern banking institutions to be formed. Oops, I forgot one. I forgot the Medici family. I wanted to mention them. Okay, so the Medici emerged as the bankers to the Catholic Church in the early 15th century, and they collected the tithes from church members. The Medici refrained from making loans to princes and kings because they knew that they were pretty poor risks, and so they remained profitable until its London operation succumbed to making loans to Edward VI, and he used those funds to fight the War of the Roses, which he did not fare well in and defaulted. And so the Medici ended up with some serious financial problems as well. I didn't trace their whole history, but so I don't know how long they continued to be a significant partner with the Catholic Church, but I assume that they did so. Maybe someone else knows the answer to that. So with this, we get to the beginnings of the modern era. And this is a image of the first real modern bank. This is the old town hall in Amsterdam where the bank was founded in 1609, and it was founded as a deposit bank. It protected the city, was protected by the city of Amsterdam. So it's got its charter from the city, and its role was to take in both foreign and local coinage, which was then reminted. They also took in gold and silver bullion, and after taking a small minting and management fee, depositors were credited for the balance. So they were trying to create a new universal coinage that had a standard weight and content. And you as a depositor, you owned that money, and you basically had it in storage with the bank, and you paid the bank a fee to keep your money. And in return, the Bank of Amsterdam gave you a piece of paper. It was called receipt money, as it always is in such circumstances. The merchants with plenty of currency could not always find a sufficient quantity of good money to pay their bills of exchange. And the value of those bills, in spite of several regulations which were made to prevent it, became in a great measure uncertain. And so the bank's role is to add certainty to the market. It's just like, when you think about periods of hyperinflation, where people will get paid in currency on Monday, and by Wednesday, the amount of goods that they could purchase with that money had declined by some percent. So even when there's not hyperinflation, the idea behind the Bank of Amsterdam was to create stable monetary purchasing power. And then once the Bank of Amsterdam began doing business, here's what Smith has to say about its effect. He says, in order to remedy these inconveniences, a bank was established in 1609 under the guarantee of the city. This bank received both foreign coin and the light and worn coin of the country at its real intrinsic value in the good standard money of the country, deducting only so much as was necessary for defraying the expense of coinage and other necessary expense of management. For the value which remained after this small deduction was made, it gave a credit in its books. This credit was called bank money, which, as it represented money exactly according to the standard of the mint, was always of the same real value and intrinsically worth more than current money. Now, that that happy situation remains as long as there's not what? As long as what doesn't occur to the quantity of gold and silver coinage that's in existence.
As long as it's not increased.
Yeah, not increased dramatically. I mean, so this is in the 1630s. This is the age of exploration. It is when the Spanish are finding huge reserves, not reserves necessarily, but they're finding hordes of gold and silver in Central and South America, and from the empires of the people that had lived there for several thousand years. And they're extracting that wealth by military force and bringing it back to Europe. So the Spanish, which were not known for their industrial production, they're using this wealth to buy whatever goods they need throughout the rest of Europe. And so the influx of all that new money drives up the price of a lot of goods. And it takes a while before the productive capacity of European manufacturers and producers to increase volume enough to bring the level, the purchasing power of that money back down. So the role that the bank had is working for a time, but it's not going to last forever. And there are other factors involved. For example, and what led to the bank's real problems was during the 1630s, the bank officers began to speculate in the tulip market. Now, remember, it's important to note the bank has fees. It's receiving fees for its services. So it has its own assets. And so as long as it's investing its own assets in speculation, it's only going to lose its own real financial asset base. But what is true of banks, not every depositor comes back for their money at the same time. And so as long as confidence existed that the bank was doing its job as promised, people aren't going to come and say, here's my receipt money, I want my gold coinage. It stays in the bank. But when you have a disaster, a financial disaster like this, then all of a sudden there's a loss of confidence in the bank, and the bank is going to begin to experience a loss of its assets, and people are going to want to withdraw their money from the bank. And so in 1637, the tulip bubble burst, and with the burst, the bank's assets fell dramatically. In addition to its speculation in the tulip bulb fiasco, the bank was also making loans to the city of Amsterdam and to the Dutch East India Company. And these loans were made not out of its own assets, again, but they were issuing banknotes to make the loans with money that belonged to their depositors. And so it left the bank with only fractional reserves. So just like any run on the bank, eventually the bank is going to not be able to honor the demands for real money, and the bank's going to have to shut down, close its doors. Well, from what I've read, that it never got quite there, but other players began to think differently about the reliance on the Bank of Amsterdam, and so eventually the bank lost some of its control over the money flow in Europe to other banks that were being established. It did survive, however, until it was finally dissolved in 1796. So it was soon overtaken by this entity, the Bank of England. Now, the British are at this point very greatly engaged in their own expansion of their colonial empire, and they needed a bank to help provide the financing for the ships, for the colonies, and for the commerce that was being engaged in. So they chartered the Bank of England in 1694 with specie or hard money that was raised from investors. And then this trick is one that you need to remember, because it's a really an important step that they took. Okay, so the bank raised its financial capital from investors. The specie was then loaned to the British government. So it's no longer on the bank's books. They have a receivable, right? Nonetheless, the bank was permitted to issue banknotes equal to its original specie, with redemption that was guaranteed by the British government. So what this does is usher in right away fractional reserve banking as the common practice. Bank of Amsterdam was a full reserve bank. If it had continued to be a full reserve bank and not gotten carried away with the opportunity to speculate, and things might have been different. But that was the end of the early history. I'm now going to go to the next lecture. This one was fairly short, but I wanted to give you a historical background on how we get to the modern era. Well, so we go on to the United States and talk about the banking system and money system that came to the United States of America. And there's the Revolutionary War history, our war against the British Empire for independence, and the difficulties that occurred in raising the revenue to pay for that war, and the issuance of paper money to do so, the issue of warrants by the government that said, basically, if you're a veteran of this war, you will get these warrants that you can use to buy land cheaply after the end of the war, when the British Empire is forced to turn over a huge chunk of territory to us. And so that became exchangeable as money. The war veterans often need to pay their bills and raise their families, and so they often sold those land warrants for 1/10 of the face value to speculators, who speculated that they would eventually be able to gain huge land holdings by acquiring all these land warrants from the veterans. And there are all sorts of schemes to raise the money. What historians now pretty much accept is that most of the war was paid for by American patriots, by the American citizens, as opposed to what has previously been thought of, that in particular France was the major financier for the American Revolution. The American Revolution cost France enormously. It emptied the French treasure, and it contributed to the eventual French Revolution itself. The finance minister at the time, Turgot, who was a physiocrat, basically told the king, if you help the Americans, it is going to ruin our country. It's going to ruin our finances. We can't afford to fight another war against Britain. Well, they went ahead, and it had some consequences. In the United States, the first bank that was created was the Bank of North America in 1781. And so this is during the time when the new United States of America was still governed under the Articles of Confederation. They had the Constitution had not yet been even thought of or began to have any discussion. So the newly formed United States Bank of North America had problems of, how do we raise sufficient revenue to satisfy the debt that we do have to not only our own citizens, but to the Netherlands and to France. So the bank is chartered by Congress in response to concerns raised by this fellow, Robert Morris, who was the superintendent of finance. The bank's functions and its structure were designed by Alexander Hamilton. And for those of you who are not Americans or U.S. Americans, And for Joe, this is a language issue I always have problems with, that we're not the only Americans here in the 50 states south of Canada and north of Mexico, but we call ourselves Americans. I think it's because we would have a hard time pronouncing United Statesians. Yeah, I don't know what else, but it seems awfully uh, us centric to call ourselves the Americans, as though everyone else has got to be a hyphenated American. Anyway, that's a side discussion for a future time, perhaps. So the bank's functions were designed by Hamilton. It's capitalized with loans from the Netherlands and France. And in 1785, after the war is over, the bank's charter is repealed. So you still have the debt, you still have these issues. What are you going to do? Well, we now have a constitution. So the first bank of the United States is chartered, and it's given a 20-year charter. It begins with a capitalization of $10 million, 8 million of which came from private investors, responding to what was then the largest initial public offering held to that point in the United States, and suggests that this bank was better capitalized than banks almost anywhere else in the world. You have to convert $10 million into modern money. So I'm not sure what that is, but it's pretty significant. Maybe 200 times that. Importantly, the bank is authorized to act as the government's fiscal agent. So the first bank of the United States, collects revenues from the government. It handles its accounting function, and it has pretty significant powers. Not everyone is happy with a federal bank. These are 13, 15, 16 states that are formed as independent sovereign nations who, under the Constitution, give up some of their sovereignty, but still think of themselves primarily as sovereign states. So there's a big concern already that there is a drift away from state rights and state sovereignty, with more and more control over economic affairs, over private affairs in the federal government and in the form of this bank. Now, at the same time, the bank also functioned as a commercial bank. It took in deposits from the public, and it made loans to individuals and to businesses. This is one of the bank's banknotes. It's paper currency. And just as is discussed today about the creation of money, the bank's paper currency entered into circulation primarily by its lending activity. So it was authorized to create this paper money and lend it out. Only the bank's currency was then accepted as payment of federal taxes. So that's a pretty neat relationship. The bank is able to issue the money. There's no direct control over its relationship of money issuance to its actual specie reserves in its vaults. And everyone has to accept it because everyone has to pay federal taxes to some extent. And so the bank is extremely successful. The government is still dealing with its debt. So in 1795, the US government was able to finally settle its debt with the French government when this fellow, James Swan, who was a Boston banker, was acting as an agent for France. He negotiated a refinancing of the debt with the United States government. And the way it worked was pretty cool. Swan accepted interest-bearing bonds issued by the US government equal in value to what was owed to the French. Okay, so he now has these interest-bearing bonds. He then finds investors who purchase shares in the bonds and uses the proceeds to repay the French, and the difference is his profits. So it's got a 20-year charter that's expiring. Well, there are many attempts, even before that charter expires, to get the bank's charter lifted. But it finally gets a new charter in 1816, and it becomes the second bank of the United States. And it's building in Philadelphia on Chestnut Street. And it had 25 branch offices scattered around the nation. So just think of that in terms of the competition between the Federalists and the states' rights people. I mean, now you see you've got this major institution in Philadelphia and 25 branches scattered around the nation. This is considered to be a threat by some. It's an opportunity for investors. It's an opportunity for those who want to invest in, in domestic production, but not everyone feels as though it's in the best interest of the country. And the person who he arises as the big opponent of the bank is Andrew Jackson. The Supreme Court had affirmed its constitutionality in 1819 in a court case. However, when Andrew Jackson is elected to be president in 1829, he's not having any of it, and he decides to renew the attack. He can't do it directly, so what he does is this: he orders all federal deposits removed from the bank in 1833. And without the federal deposits, the bank is simply a commercial bank. And so the bank loses its federal charter 3 years later, and it finally ceases operations in 1841. So you have 1841 until the war between the states, or the Civil War, and you have now, in that period of time, that 20-year period of time, a very decentralized system of state charter banks. And the country needs some sort of decentralized system, because, as this image shows, people are now migrating into the vast North American interior in large numbers. So currency and credit is desperately needed to meet the needs of this growing economy. And so banking interests responded. Everywhere that there's a community establishing, it's in a territory, they try to get chartered by the territorial government. When the state government is finally formed, there's enough people that they petition to have the territory converted into a state. One of the first things they're going to do is pass a banking law that allows state banks to be chartered in that geography. And so after 1816, regulation of the banks is left to the states, and new banks were subscribed with some gold coinage, some specie, but there's almost no control over the issuance of banknotes. I mean, there aren't a lot of regulators. There aren't a lot of people who go from the state capital out into the hinterland to some of these small communities that have these banks opening up. So there's about 700 plus state banks that are now in existence in 1830s and 40s. And their money, their currency, is discounted anywhere from 0 to 100% based on public confidence in the bank and their knowledge of the bank. So just think of it this way. Michael, you're in London, okay, and it's 1840, and this is the system you're living under. So there's a bank in Bristol, and a merchant in London sells something to someone in Bristol, and the merchant in Bristol wants to pay the London merchant with Bristol bank currency. The merchant in London doesn't really know anything about who owns the Bank of Bristol, and so he says, okay, I'll accept your money, but at a 20% discount. Now the London merchant has these Bristol bank currencies, and he's doing business with someone, let's say in Scotland somewhere. and no one in Scotland knows anything about the Bristol Bank. And so the merchant in Scotland says, okay, I'll take those Bristol Bank dollars, but I'll discount them 50%. I'll give you 50 cents on the dollar. So the longer the distance is from the relationship between the two merchants, the bank money is going to have less and less purchasing power. And that is one of the great disadvantages of the system, although it means that people are pricing for the risk. No one knows how long this bank out in the hinterland is going to exist. They don't know how well it's capitalized. They don't know if it's making a lot of bad loans that will be able to honor its debts. So that's what was called the period of wildcat banking in the United States. This is Alan Greenspan, who was a longtime chairman of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. And in a speech that he delivered some years ago, he suggested this, which leads to an interesting conclusion, I think. He says, more recently, some scholars have suggested that the problems of the free banking period were exaggerated. Retrospective analyses have shown, for example, that losses to banknote holders and bank failures were not out of line with other comparable periods in U.S. banking history. Now, that sounds like a very optimistic, positive statement, don't you think? However, in terms of our history with money in banks, it's never been good. So, I don't know. From the statement from the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, it's an indication in my mind that he wasn't a very good monetary historian. We've had bank failures and panics one after another from the time that Robert Morris was involved as superintendent of finance. Well, getting back to the wildcat banking, one researcher, this fellow, Edmund Simmons, he wrote this in 1984 about it. His research brought him to a rather different conclusion. He's than the former Fed secretary, chairman. In some states, particularly Michigan, where more than 40 banks failed before the system was declared unconstitutional, the system is better characterized as a fiasco than a failure. So it leaves the nation at this point in time, the population, with not much confidence in the banking system, because they don't know if in the next economic downturn, if whatever they have on deposit with their local bank, if that bank is going to be able to honor it if they go to the bank and ask for their money. And so as the United States came to mid-century, there was renewed momentum for reform and try to get monetary stability established. And by the onset of the Civil War, the state banks had grown to almost 1,600 across the states. Then, with Lincoln as president, they moved forward with reforms, and they passed two acts: the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864. And these acts attempted to some degree to put federal control over the banking system without formation of another central bank. And they did this by creating a system of national banks. They established a uniform national currency, and they established an active secondary market for treasury securities so that this would help raise the revenue to finance the Union's war expenses. And most of you have already heard the story about greenbacks, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So as a result of these two banking acts being passed, the number of state banks fell from the 1,600 level to only 325 by 1870. This is 5 years after the Civil War ends. So the national banks are taking hold, but there's innovation. I mean, the people in the state banks aren't sitting still. The surviving state banks responded by offering customers something brand new. They called it a checking account as a substitute for bank notes. So as a result, by 1890, only 10% of the nation's money supply was in the form of currency. Combined with lower capital and reserve requirements, as well as the ease with which states issued banking charters, state banks again became the dominant banking structure by the late 1880s. So, you know what the value of a checking account is. You don't need to have, cash on you at all times. And I think I read a statistic fairly recently that this 10% of our nation's money supply in the form of currency is about where it sits today. We still use cash for a lot of transactions, but increasingly there are companies, there are businesses that won't even take cash. That they only will accept a debit card or a credit card. I don't know if that's the situation in other countries.